Yeah, it was cool. It was,
Good morning, and welcome to the First Existentialist Congregation of Atlanta. We are a philosophically based spiritual community founded on existential philosophy and feminist principles and dedicated to human liberation and the protection of the natural world. My name is Patton White, and I will be facilitating this morning's celebration of life. We have a virtual home in the church, which was hand-built 100 years ago by the African-American Antioch East Baptist Church. We honor their labors of love and the powerful history of this special place. We acknowledge that our spiritual home stands on land forcibly taken from the Muskogee Creek people. We support justice and equality for all Indigenous people. Our opening words this morning: for who are we if not the sum of our experiences, the things that we gather and collect in life? Once you strip those away, we become just a mass of flesh, bone, and blood vessels. This is a quote by C.J. Tudor from the Chop. This morning we have it is Balm in Gilead, or There is a Balm in Gilead, and leading us this morning are Mick Kinney on the piano, Robert Stewart, Jean Heinrich, and myself. Please rise and body your spirit as you are willing and able to join in singing or humming along to Balm in Gilead. Thank you so much to the musicians for that rendition of Balm in Gilead. Our speaker today, Reverend Kimberly Quinn Johnson, serves as minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the South Fork on Long Island in Bridgehampton, New York. Her ministry and her preaching encourage us to connect to our most deeply held values so that we can live our faith in the world. Before ministry, Kimberly worked as a union organizer with the UAW. She also taught women's and gender studies at New Jersey City University. The core of Kimberly's ministry is faith formation, creating spaces and experiences for people to connect to the sacred and to express that connection in the world. In her teaching, Kimberly employs the theory and practice of popular education, facilitating the exchange and exploration of our knowledge and experiences to encourage deeper understanding and grounding for action. Kimberly serves on the organizing collective board for BLUU, or Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. Kimberly also serves as co-chair of the UUA Appointments Committee and is a member of the steering committee for UU class conversations and the Board of Trustees of the UU Women's Federation. She also serves as vice president of the St. Lawrence Foundation for Theological Education. She gets to work at the nexus of faith formation, youth ministry, and racial justice as a program leader with the UU College of Social Justice, and she's likely to be spending her summer working with youth through UU Summer Seminary, or Thrive, leadership experiences for youth of color. And now, Reverend Johnson.
This sermon is inspired by the work of Audre Lorde, especially an address that she gave to a group of women's studies scholars at Amherst College in 1980. This is an excerpt from Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference. And I'll let Audre Lorde introduce herself in her own words. As a 49-year-old Black, lesbian, feminist, socialist mother of two, including one boy, and a member of an interracial couple, I usually find myself a part of some group defined as other, deviant, inferior, or just plain wrong. Traditionally, in American society, it is the members of oppressed, objectified groups who are expected to stretch out and bridge the gap between the actualities of our lives and the consciousness of our oppressor. In other words, those of us for whom oppression is as American as apple pie have always had to be watchers, to become familiar with the language and manners of the oppressor, even sometimes adopting them for some illusion of protection. Institutionalized rejection of difference is an absolute necessity in a profit economy which needs outsiders as surplus people. As members of such an economy, we have all been programmed to respond to the human differences between us with fear and loathing, and to handle those differences in one of three ways: ignore it, and if that is not possible, copy it if we think it's dominant, or destroy it if we think it is subordinate. But we have no patterns for relating across our human differences as equals. As a result, those differences have been misnamed and misused in the interest, the service of separation and confusion. Certainly, there are very real differences between us of race, age, and sex, but it is not those differences between us that are separating us. It is rather our refusal to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects upon our human behavior and expectation. Racism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others, and thereby the right to dominance. Sexism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one sex over the other, and thereby the right to dominance. Ageism, heterosexism, elitism, classism. Too often, we pour the energy needed for recognizing and exploring difference into pretending those differences are insurmountable barriers or that they do not exist at all. This results in a voluntary isolation or false and treacherous connections. Either way, we do not develop tools for using human difference as a springboard for creative change within our lives. We speak not of human difference, but of human deviance. Refusing to recognize difference makes it impossible to see the different problems and pitfalls facing us as women, as people. The need for unity is often misnamed as a need for homogeneity. As a Black lesbian feminist comfortable with the many different ingredients of my identity, and as a woman committed to racial and sexual freedom from oppression, I find I am constantly being encouraged to pluck out some one aspect of myself and present this as the meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying other parts of myself. But this is destructive and a fragmenting way to live. My fullest concentration of energy is available to me only when I integrate all the parts of who I am openly, allowing power from one particular source of my living to flow back and forth freely through all my different selves without the restrictions of externally imposed definition. Only then can I bring myself and my energies as a whole to the service of those struggles which I embrace as part of my living. It is not our differences which separate us as women, but our reluctance to recognize those differences and to deal effectively with the distortions which have resulted from ignoring and misnaming those differences. So I'm a Unitarian Universalist. And when I want to describe for people what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist, I usually point out our first and our seventh principles as two pillars, two opposite poles of our faith. The first principle affirms the inherent worth and dignity of each and every person. And the seventh principle affirms that we, each and every one of us, are part of an interdependent web of existence. Together, these two present the paradox of our faith. Individuality, or independence, versus relationship, our interdependence. On the one hand, this first principle asks us to consider what is unique and singular about each of us. On the other hand, the seventh principle asks us to consider the ways that we are interconnected, the ways that we are linked in what the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. called the inescapable network of mutuality, a single garment of destiny. I don't think this paradox is unique to Unitarian Universalists. I think it is a primary puzzle of how we live in community authentically, maintaining our true selves, living deeply into our identities, while also being open to community and what is possible by a life lived in community. It may be a particularly American contradiction, A country that prides itself on diversity, that is at once heterogeneous and at the same time grasping for a national identity. That's what the Founding Fathers, and they are recorded in history as fathers, that's what they meant when they said e pluribus unum, out of many one. But I want to ask, how do we do the reverse? How do we hold the core, unum, while also allowing for the fullness of diversity within that core? E, unum, pluribus. I recognize the challenge here. In a world, a political climate, not just in this country, but around the globe, where we are more divided than ever, there is a longing to hold on to cling to the ways that we are alike and connected. And yet this longing to cling to the things that hold us together often slides into what Audre Lorde described as a refusal to acknowledge our differences, a fear of approaching our differences with rigor and seriousness. I want to start by talking about the fear. What I hear in this fear is a real tenderness, a real wariness about getting it wrong or not knowing how to get it right. Sometimes this is expressed as exasperation with political correctness, chafing at the expectation that we talk and behave in ways that are sensitive to those around us. Sometimes it is expressed as being confounded by the changes in language, changes in the very terms that we use to identify ourselves and others. We don't want to be called out as racist, or sexist, or ableist, or classist, or just plain wrong. We don't want to be wrong. I get that. It can feel as if we are navigating a shifting landscape, a rapid revolution, sometimes too rapid. How can we keep up with the world changing so swiftly around us? I grew up in a time when African American was a polite way to describe my race, and then people of color to describe a more inclusive identity, and then Black to suggest a more politically affirmative identity. And now, all of a sudden, within a year, everyone is using BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. Unless, of course, we're talking about Latinx people with an X, no longer simply Latino or Latina, or even Hispanic. Growing up, gay and lesbian were appropriate terminology. More recently, LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And now, LGBTQI+. A decade ago, differently abled felt like a politically correct, or at least a polite way to refer to people who are disabled. Now, our disabled siblings are telling us something different. They tell us that this and other alternatives can feel disempowering, patronizing, and hurtful. Euphemisms like challenged, handicapable, differently abled, and special needs only serve to mask the speaker's discomfort with difference. While these euphemisms may make people who are not disabled feel comfortable, they do nothing to address the ways that our society and our institutions are organized to accommodate certain kinds of bodies and not others. The fact is, language matters. Words have power, and they influence the ways that we think about the world and the people around us. But this is not only about having correct words and correct language. This is about our willingness to change and to grow, our willingness to be vulnerable in our imperfection. It is about our willingness to listen and to follow the lead of directly impacted people. Quite simply, it is about respect. Our language is always changing. The question is, are we willing and able to change with it? Are we willing and able to make the effort, to try to see others and to acknowledge our differences with openness and with curiosity and not fear? Are we willing to be, as activist Mary Hookes mandates, transformed in the service of the work? I think that willingness comes from love. And when I talk about love here, I mean the fierce love that Reverend King talked about when he stood before the Southern Christian Leadership Conference right here in Atlanta, right there in Atlanta in 1967. He said, "I'm not talking about emotional bosh when I talk about love. I'm talking about strong, demanding love. The kind of love that King describes as the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend." The point is not to be perfect, but to do our best, to try with open-heartedness, to enter into relationships, to deepen into relationships, with a willingness to forgive ourselves and others. I know this is hard work, and it can feel scary. And some of us, probably you, because I know sometimes I do, sometimes we wish we could return to a time when we knew the rules and we were safe in our expressions and our interactions. But cultural theorist Bell Hooks reminds us that the practice of love offers no place for safety. We risk loss, hurt, pain. We risk being acted upon by forces outside of our control. I want to say that again because I think this point that Bell Hooks makes is really important. The practice of love offers no place of safety. We risk loss, hurt, pain. We risk being acted upon by forces outside of our control. Far too often, I witness the ways that we in our religious communities, and particularly in communities where people are politically liberal, I witness the ways that we in our religious communities and in our lives fall into the pitfall that Lord describes of refusing to acknowledge difference. I hear things all the time like, we're all the same, or I don't see color, or LBGXYZ, none of that matters. Believe me when I say it matters. It matters when people see you. I think I know what people mean when they say we're all the same. They're pointing to, I think, the sense that we are all human, that there is something about us that connects us, that draws us together into a human family, or if we're stretching, together into the family of earth beings, human and non-human alike, our expansive, interdependent web of life. But behind the sentiment, underneath this insistence that we are all the same, is the sense that we need to be the same in order to be able to care about each other, in order to love each other. My question here is, do I have to be like you in order for you to love me? Do I have to be like you in order for you to care about me and my life? Can you love me even if I am so clearly different from you? When I talk about love here, I don't mean like me a lot. I don't mean want to have me around. I definitely don't mean appreciate that I bring a superficial diversity to spaces. I mean, again, that demanding love that Reverend King talks about. I mean love as an act of will that Bell Hooks talks about. She writes that love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing our own or another's spiritual growth. Love is as love does. Love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love. We choose to love. When we understand love as the will to nurture our own and another's spiritual growth, it becomes clear that we cannot claim to love if we are hurtful and abusive. Love and abuse cannot coexist. Love, from King and Hooks and myself, love means that we try to know each other. Love means that we fight for each other. When I'm faced with the refusal to acknowledge difference, the very real differences that mark our lives, that shape our opportunities, that color our access to power and safety, it raises the question, how can I trust you? How can I trust you if you don't see me? If you don't see and understand the ways that my life is constrained and oppressed? How can I trust you if you can't acknowledge the real threat and danger that I face? And if even after I tell you, you still refuse to acknowledge it, instead clinging to this myth of sameness? How can I trust you to fight against the things that oppress me if you refuse to acknowledge the things that make us different? Race, sex, class, ability, age. If you refuse to acknowledge the forces that make our lives different, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, ageism, how can I truly trust you to have my back? How can I trust you to fight with me against these things? Nobody is asking for perfection. At least people in good faith are not asking for perfection. We're asking for you, we're asking for each other to try to see each other, try to understand each other, try to know each other, and not hide behind the impossibility of perfection. The idea that we can't possibly truly know someone different, and since we can't possibly get it right, why even bother to try? There's a tendency when we're talking about things that are different and touchy or new a tendency to feel embarrassment or shame when we make mistakes, when we get things wrong, especially when we get things wrong in ways that don't represent who we really believe we are. When we get things wrong in ways that don't represent who we want to be. But there is no room for shame here. The stakes are too high to hide behind that. I do the work that I do because I believe so deeply in our possibility and our promise, in our power to transform the world in big ways and in small ways. When we unleash this powerful love on the world around us, that is beloved community. That is collective liberation. But how can we possibly hope to be part of healing the fractures in our community and our nation and our world if we cannot even heal the fractures at home, when we won't even see them? 40 years ago, Audre Lorde shared, I am constantly being encouraged to pluck out some one aspect of myself and present this as the meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of myself. But this, she says, is destructive and a fragmenting way to live. My fullest concentration of energy is available to me only when I integrate all the parts of who I am, openly allowing power from particular sources of my living to flow back and forth freely through all of my different selves, without the restrictions of externally imposed definition. Only then can I bring myself and my energies as a whole to the service of those struggles which I embrace as part of my living. She challenged us to develop tools for using human difference as a springboard for creative change within our lives. Friends, the world needs people who are whole, who, like Lord, can bring ourselves and our energies as a whole to the service of those struggles that we commit our lives to. The world needs people who can live fully into themselves. People who aren't forced to hide or deny parts of themselves in order to fit in order to honor our connections. We do not have to think alike in order to love alike. We do not need to ignore our very real differences in order to realize unity. Rather than ignore difference, we can develop the tools, the skill, and capacity for using difference as a springboard for creative change within our lives and our communities. In this world that is moving at once too quickly and too slowly, may we find that courage to live fully into ourselves and make it possible too for those around us.
Thank you so much to Reverend Johnson. Please join us on Zoom immediately after this broadcast for our meet and greet, where we will be discussing the topics raised in this morning's presentation, as well as sharing personal joys, sorrows, and concerns, and community announcements. Next week, we will be welcoming back Dr. Rob Baker with his talk, The Travels of Joseph Bedney, From Freedom to Slavery and Back Again. We hope to see you either on Zoom immediately following this broadcast. You can find the link to the Zoom meeting in the chat section of today's broadcast, or we hope to see you next Sunday at 11 a.m. Thanks so much for being with us today, and have a great rest of your day today and a great week. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.